Where do we stay as people who believe in one living and personal God? Let's look at history. Anthropologists found out that at the beginning of time, at the beginning of mankind, almost everyone believed in one God. So that is called monotheism. But then the gods proliferated. There were multiple gods. There was one god for rain, there was one god for sun, there was one god for fertility, and so on. So it was quite fashionable to have many gods in your repertoire. And in that time, Israel was the first to break with that ruling polytheism of the time by proclaiming one God. You can see here, it's a graphic by Simon Davies. You can look up on the internet. That's many different mythologies. They were the predecessors of nowadays religions, of modern religions. Let's go to where we are now. Well, over 2/3 of the world believe in one God who created us. And well over half the world believes in the God of Israel. That is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Over half the world. So we came from a very ancient time where at the beginning people were having that personal, direct relationship to one God, as anthropologists found out. And through this time where there was a proliferation of gods, or multiple gods, for every cause there was a god, to a period where we come back to the belief in one God who created us. And that's where we are now. And how did it happen? Well, this is another graphic by Simon Davies. You see, in the middle you have Judaism, around 1000 before Christ. And every religion around that time was polytheistic, so they had multiple gods. If you remember the Old Testament, the Jews were warned against mixing with those pagan cultures around them, because they were all having multiple gods. And God is a jealous God. He wants to have a personal relationship with you. And these people, they completely broke with polytheism. So how and why? If everyone around them has that polytheism, and it was fashionable. It's like having multiple cars, it's cool. It's a status symbol. You have multiple gods. It's powerful. The more gods you have, the more powerful you appear. So how did they come to that conclusion that they should only have one God? Definitely not because of human intellectual endeavors, but because they had a direct relationship with that God, because that God directly talked to them. It was that personal God, that loving God, that had an interaction with these people. So, what does it mean to us? Of the world religions, only Buddhism doesn't believe explicitly in one superior God. But that's perhaps more due to the context of its founder and the environment in which he developed. Buddhism seeks enlightenment at a time where many are gripped by occult powers and pagan cults. Dhammapada says, gripped by fear, people go to sacred mountains, sacred groves, sacred trees and shrines. Hence, Buddhism scorns worshipping or any attachment to sacrificed idols. So, Buddhism was 500 years later, you can see here. So we have Judaism 1000 before Christ, and Buddhism on the right, about the same height. We have Buddhism around 500 before Christ. So Buddhism came later, but Buddhism was still within a world. There was no concept of Judaism. So that the world of Buddhism, the world where Buddha grew up, was a world of multiple gods, polytheism, and figures, and shrines, trees, sculptures, pictures, whatever, idols, man-made stuff. And Buddhism scorns this because it's only paper, it's nothing. And idolatry is also utmost scorned by the God of Israel 500 years before. They were the first to give up polytheism. They were the first to criticize polytheism. It was revolutionary. And idolatry refers to anything that moves attention away from God. You shall have no other gods before me. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, and so on. All that pagan stuff. Like a scarecrow in a cucumber field, their idols cannot speak. They must be carried because they cannot walk. Do not fear them. They can do no harm, nor can they do any good. That's so clear and so modern at that time, and still is. That's enlightenment. Because that's saying, don't take these sculptures, don't take this paper stuff, don't take this earthly stuff as a God, because there's nothing behind it. And that's enlightenment. And that's where Buddhism and Judaism are very close by. They both reject polytheism and the worshipping of idols. But there's a difference. The first excerpt is a theory based on an empirical observation that people who are gripped by fear go to sacred things to find relief. That's an observation you can make and draw that conclusion that you better not find relief in those things if you want true relief from suffering. And that's the aim of Buddhism, to show a way out of suffering. And if you believe that these figures and puppets have any power, you will be disappointed because they don't, and that will be suffering. So just don't even stop believing in this stuff. And that's very close to Judaism. It's very close to what God tells his people in the Bible. But the excerpts from the Bible are based on a direct conversation with God. So it's not a theoretical conclusion. It's not based on an empirical observation. It's based on God's word. And this God is strong and can end all suffering. Now, whatever your view of God and our enlightenment is, if you take the text at face value, it would still be very reasonable. However enlightened or not you are, however far in your journey you are. And that's this special relationship with God. Because God doesn't care at which level you are. The God of Israel is a loving God who looks after his children, like a parent looks after his children, and like a parent who loves their children no matter what they do and no matter what they accomplish. And that's the big difference here. You can read this from the Bible. You can read these excerpts from the Bible and you can completely understand them. It doesn't matter how intellectual advanced you are, how enlightened you are. You just read them. If you understand basic words, you can understand what God is trying to say here. You don't need a degree. You don't need any level of advancement, enlightenment. And this is the very quality of the Word of God, the Bible, that demonstrates that someone superior really cares, and that someone is God. So, what's wrong? All major religions can agree on this, that only by detaching oneself from worldly desires can one attain something higher. Hence, we need to purify ourselves. But because we often fail doing so, the God of Israel is shown to love his people, despite the dismal efforts. Like a good parent loves his children, despite what they do and what they accomplish or not. And when even these dismal efforts ceased, so they didn't care about God at all. There was no love of God among them. That's why Christians believe that God so much loved the world, the children, that God manifested himself personally through Jesus. God personally taught his people how to perfect, purify themselves, and showed them the love of God, so they can simply follow his example. But because most people already digressed from God's love, they couldn't see God's work in his actions, and persecuted him as an outrageous impostor, sentencing him to death. And that's why Christians believe God presented himself as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. Now, this may sound far-fetched to an uninhibited listener, but whoever studied the Old Testament agrees that God has shown unconditional love to his people. Unconditional love, like a parent loves his children. And it doesn't matter where you are and what you do. If you don't listen, if you're not having contact with your parents, your dad or your mom is traveling down to find you. That's love. And that's exactly the love of God. If you stop talking to God, if you stop listening, like children of God did at that time, then what can you do else than track them down where they are and dwell among them? And he did. But they didn't understand him, because they were already so far away from understanding the love of God. And they killed him. They killed God, because they didn't have that love of God in them. And that's a sacrifice God had to make, because that's the only way for people to understand and to see that they've done something, well, bad, and that they can change and start listening. Because he also gave an example, a living example. It's a documented example. You can read about it. even in not only in the Bible, but in Roman literature and in Roman records, as well as in Jewish records. The Jews recorded in their Talmud that around after Jesus' death, and for the rest of time ever, their yearly animal sacrifices were not accepted by God anymore. Why? Because God already sacrificed himself on the cross. God sacrificed himself on the cross for the sins. Forget your goat and your cow and your bird and whatever you bring on the altar. It's nothing compared to God sacrificing himself. That if God sacrifices himself, that's all it takes. There's nothing more needed. In summary, while in Buddhism and Hinduism the individual is mostly left alone in improving his lot, the God of Israel is shown loving and actively helping us, despite or because of our dismal ability to do so. In Christianity, the love and help of God is notched up full gear through God sacrificing himself for our sin. That's unrivaled. Here is God also personal in the supreme sense of manifesting self-giving, sacrificial love. That's unrivaled among any religion. A God that gives himself as sacrifice because he so much loved us. And from our side, it only takes complete trust and faith in God to attain perfection. Yet as it turns out, that complete surrender of one's self under God's authority is utmost challenging, because it completely negates our accomplishments and illusion of control. So that's even more challenging than going through all the stages of enlightenment. Because it says that your accomplishments and your work does not suffice. It's not helpful at all. That's a very harsh insight about your abilities. And if you can accept that, that's a challenge to accept that you can't, that you failed. All of the major religions operate on the basis of us controlling through our accomplishments our destiny. Christianity, if taken seriously, negates this assumption because God has already accomplished what's to be done. All what's left is to accept and yield control to God. Obviously, whoever is controlled completely by God does good works. And that settles the question whether Christians only require faith and not works. Yes, Christians only require complete faith. Because complete faith means complete giving up control completely to God. And when you give up control completely to God, and God is working completely in you, your output can only be godly. Your works can only be godly. The problem is that few yield control completely to God. And yet this is what Bhakti Yoga in Hinduism aims to accomplish. If they only had that self-giving, sacrificial love of God in their program, but they don't. So let's look at Jesus, because he did.